In 1941, as the winds of war swept across the globe and America edged closer to the conflict it had hoped to avoid, a small airfield near Tuskegee, Alabama, became the stage for a battle that had nothing to do with enemy fighters or flak-filled skies. The real enemy, there was doubt, systemic, calculated, and deeply rooted in the convictions of the U.S. military establishment. The Army Air Corps had spent decades claiming that black men were unfit for combat aviation. Their official reports said they lacked the intelligence required for navigation, the reflexes needed for dogfighting, and the emotional discipline necessary to survive aerial warfare. These beliefs weren't whispered, they were written into training manuals, staffing policies, and internal memos that openly argued against integrating aviation. Yet political pressure was rising. Eleanor Roosevelt had taken a flight with Charles Chief Anderson at the Tuskegee Institute earlier that year. At 57 years old, the First Lady climbed into the front seat of an open cockpit biplane and spent nearly an hour soaring over the Alabama countryside with a black instructor at the controls. When she stepped out of the aircraft, windblown and exhilarated, she said a single sentence that would change military history. "Well, you can fly all right." And she carried that conviction straight back to the White House. Congress responded with Public Law 18, passed in early 1941, forcing the War Department to create a black flying unit. They did so grudgingly. The Army selected Tuskegee, Alabama, a remote Jim Crow stronghold, precisely because it was isolated, hard to access, and far from the political spotlight. If the program failed, it would fail quietly. No reporters, no headlines, no public embarrassment. When Tuskegee Army Airfield officially opened in July 1941, it didn't resemble the gleaming modern training bases the white cadets used. The runways were short and patched together with gravel and tar. Training aircraft were often hand-me-down machines that other bases had rejected. Maintenance equipment was outdated or improvised. Nothing about the setup suggested the Air Corps expected success. It was a deliberate design for failure, disguised as compliance with federal orders. The first aviation cadets arrived into this atmosphere of hostility. Many were college graduates, some were seasoned mechanics, and others were athletes or honor students who had already overcome barriers just to get here. But the instructors, white officers transferred from other bases, had been told to expect the worst. Rumors had circulated through the Air Corps that black cadets would wash out at triple the rate of white trainees. Some instructors arrived angry, others skeptical, but few were open-minded. They stood across from cadets, arms folded, waiting for mistakes that would confirm their biases. Leading these cadets was a quiet, disciplined officer whose entire life had been shaped by isolation. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., son of the Army's first black general, had graduated from West Point in 1936 after enduring 4 years of enforced silence. His classmates refused to speak to him except on official duty. They never sat with him, marched with him, or acknowledged his presence socially. He lived in a cocoon of deliberate exclusion, building a reservoir of internal strength that would carry him through even greater challenges. Now, at Tuskegee, he faced an institution determined to make him fail, but he had learned long ago how to stand alone. Training at Tuskegee was merciless. At white training bases, cadets who struggled with aerobatics or radio navigation received extra instruction. At Tuskegee, any sign of weakness was grounds for elimination. White cadets received multiple chances to pass check rides. Black cadets were given one. The Air Corps had engineered the process to produce catastrophic attrition, but the men who came to Tuskegee refused to break. They studied longer, practiced harder, and built informal study groups after hours, tutoring each other late into the night. Their motivation wasn't just to earn pilot wings. Their performance carried the hopes of 13 million black Americans who had been told their entire lives that aviation, like so many other professions, was off-limits to them. On March 7, 1942, 5 cadets graduated from the first class. They stood on the tarmac, wearing newly minted silver wings, the Alabama sun glinting off their uniforms. George Roberts, Benjamin C. Davis, Jr., Lemuel Custis, Charles DeBow, Mac Ross. 5 men who defied a century of racist assumptions and proved that black pilots could master the most complex combat skill the U.S. military had to offer. The Air Corps had expected failure. Instead, they had to open more training slots because now the program was officially and undeniably real. By mid-1943, enough pilots had graduated to form a full fighter group, the 332nd Fighter Group, consisting of the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Everything about these units was segregated: pilots, mechanics, armorers, supply officers. Every single specialist was black. It wasn't a point of pride for the War Department. It was an experiment they expected to collapse under its own weight, especially once real combat began. The equipment they were given said everything about those expectations. White fighter units were receiving P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, modern powerful aircraft with strong climb rates and lethal firepower. The 332nd received P-40 Warhawks, older aircraft already being phased out of frontline combat. They were durable but slower than German fighters, less maneuverable at high altitudes, and often worn from previous units. It was a subtle message. The Air Corps wanted them to perform token missions, pose for photographs if needed, and then quietly fade from the war. Colonel Davis saw things differently. He understood the stakes. When white pilots failed or lost bombers, it was chalked up to enemy skill or bad weather. When his men failed, it would reinforce the belief that black pilots didn't belong in the cockpit at all. Every mission would be under a microscope, every mistake magnified. The pressure was immense. Each pilot was fighting not just for survival, but for the right of future generations to fly. The first true test came when the 99th Fighter Squadron deployed to North Africa in June 1943. Their first combat escort mission to Pantelleria was uneventful, a gentle introduction to the war. But days later, the reality of air combat struck hard. On June 9, Lieutenant Charles Hall scored the unit's first aerial victory against a German Focke-Wulf 190. It was a moment of triumph, but not enough to silence their critics. Then came July 2, 1943, a day that nearly destroyed everything they had built. During a mission over Sicily, the 99th was ambushed by a dozen Messerschmitt Bf 109s diving out of the sun. 2 P-40s were shot down almost instantly. Lieutenant Sherman White died when his aircraft exploded. Lieutenant James McCullin bilayed out and was captured. The remaining pilots scattered, each fighting for survival. When they returned to base, the white commanders of the 33rd Fighter Group filed reports accusing the 99th of lacking aggression and discipline. Colonel William Momia, their white commanding officer, submitted a scathing report to Washington recommending that the 99th be removed from combat and reassigned to low-risk coastal patrol duties. Time magazine published an article echoing the criticism, questioning whether black pilots lacked the temperament for aerial combat. It was a coordinated attempt, intentional or not, to discredit the entire Tuskegee experiment. But Momia's report left out one crucial detail. His own white pilots flying the same P-40s had suffered identical losses. The aircraft was obsolete. German fighters were faster, climbed higher, and outperformed the P-40 in nearly every category. But racism doesn't depend on facts. It depends on narrative, and the narrative was swinging fast against the Tuskegee Airmen. At this point, Colonel Davis did something bold. He requested an audience with General Ira Eaker, commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. Standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the theater, Davis presented mission statistics proving that the 99th's loss rates were no worse than white squadrons. He argued that the P-40 was the problem, not the pilots. General Eaker didn't dissolve the squadron. Instead, he approved plans to bring the entire 332nd Fighter Group to Italy and equip them with modern fighters. By early 1944, the 332nd arrived in Italy at a muddy, windswept airfield near Ramitelli. Their new aircraft awaited them, P-47 Thunderbolts. The pilots loved the heavy, rugged Thunderbolt, its 8.50 caliber machine guns, and its ability to absorb punishment. But this would be temporary. By late spring, the 332nd transitioned to one of the most advanced aircraft in the war, the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang changed everything. With its Rolls-Royce-designed Merlin engine, it could climb faster, fly higher, and travel deeper into enemy territory than almost any fighter in the world. Now the Tuskegee Airmen had the tool they needed to prove beyond any question what they were capable of. But their mission profile changed too. No longer would they fly ground attack missions or fighter sweeps. The 332nd was now assigned the most politically sensitive mission in the 15th Air Force, long-range bomber escort. They would protect white bomber crews flying B-17s and B-24s deep into Germany. This assignment carried extraordinary pressure. If bomber losses increased on their watch, racist commanders would have ammunition to dismantle the program entirely, and bombers were dying in shocking numbers. In early 1944, US bomber crews flying into Germany had a statistical survival rate of 1 in 3. Colonel Davis understood that fighter doctrine was failing. Fighter pilots were being taught that their primary mission was air superiority, shoot down German fighters wherever they could find them. But in practice, this meant they often abandoned the bombers they were supposed to protect. German fighter squadrons learned to send small decoy formations to lure American escorts away. When the escorts chased these bait groups, the main German force would dive in and rip the bomber formations apart. It was effective, it was deadly, and it was predictable. Davis made a decision that went against every fighter doctrine in the book. His pilots would stay with the bombers at all times. No chasing, no breaking formation, no pursuit, even if German fighters presented easy targets. Their mission was singular: bring the bombers home. This simple shift would rewrite air combat history. And over the next months, the skies of Europe would witness a transformation so dramatic that bomber crews would begin requesting the Red Tails by name. They had flown enough missions to prove they could survive the war's brutality, and over the next months, the skies of Europe would witness a transformation so dramatic that bomber crews would begin requesting the Red Tails by name. It was not a matter of favoritism. It was a matter of statistics, behavior, and trust formed inside formations moving through hostile airspace. As the 332nd stepped into full escort duty, the discipline they carried from Tuskegee and North Africa would begin shaping outcomes that analysts and commanders could not ignore. The transition into long-range escort operations did not begin with ceremony or public recognition. It began in the quiet hours before dawn, when ground crews moved along rows of P-51 Mustangs, checking oxygen lines, securing engine cowlings, and tightening the last bolts on machine gun access panels. It began in the briefings, where meteorologists traced the cold fronts moving across Austria and Hungary, where intelligence officers marked expected fighter resistance with red arrows pointing toward the Adriatic Sea, and where navigation teams calculated fuel burn rates based on headwinds blowing across the Italian coast. It began in the minds of pilots who understood that their role was not simply to engage the enemy, but to remain alongside hundreds of bombers traveling in tight, vulnerable formations through altitudes filled with flak and fighters. As they prepared for each mission, the principles that had shaped their training at Tuskegee remained intact, guiding every decision they would make in the months ahead. Their escort doctrine, though developed under the pressure of skepticism and oversight, proved both simple and demanding. The fighter groups around them operated within the conventional framework that prioritized aggressive engagement. The 332nd focused on proximity, predictability, and consistency. Their presence near the bombers was constant enough to be seen from cockpit windows, creating the visual reassurance that the crews on board depended on. While other groups maneuvered through wide arcs, sweeping ahead of the formation to hunt for enemy aircraft, the Red Tails remained close, moving in positions that ensured they could respond to threats without creating vulnerabilities. This approach required continuous attention to spacing, altitude, and heading. Pilots adjusted throttle settings with precision, maintaining station in turbulent air while scanning the horizon for distant shapes moving across the sky. The first weeks of full escort operations revealed the practical effects of this doctrine. As bomber crews moved toward strategic targets in Germany, Romania, Austria, and the Balkans, they reported fewer gaps in their defensive screens. The defensive guns of the heavy bombers, aimed by crews with limited visibility and heavy workloads, relied on escorts to intercept attackers before they approached firing range. The 332nd positioned themselves to intercept head-on attacks, flank approaches, and diving assaults from above. The Mustang's speed gave them the ability to close gaps rapidly, and their proximity to the bombers made reaction times shorter than in formations where escorts operated farther away. The Luftwaffe's tactics at this stage of the war varied by theater and available aircraft. Bf-109s often performed slashing attacks, diving from high altitude through bomber formations, firing a burst of cannon rounds before pulling away. FW-190s favored beam attacks from the sides, approaching at oblique angles designed to minimize exposure to return fire. Twin-engine Mi-410s used heavy cannons to fire from beyond the effective range of .50 caliber guns. The 332nd adjusted its defensive geometry to match these threats. The high cover position moved in relation to the altitude of the expected attack. The low cover remained close enough to counter enemy fighters approaching from beneath the formation. The lateral cover maintained horizontal spacing that allowed maneuvering without creating blind spots. These adjustments required constant mental calculations by the pilots, who integrated combat experience with the standardized procedures Davis had emphasized. Reports from bomber groups documented the differences in engagement outcomes. When German fighters attempted coordinated attacks, the Red Tails intercepted them early enough to disrupt formations before they could approach firing range. Even when the Luftwaffe attempted to exploit brief openings, the proximity of the escorts reduced the windows of vulnerability. During missions to targets such as Ploesti's oil refineries, Linz's industrial districts, and Munich's transportation hubs, the escorts and bombers moved together through layers of flak that punctuated the sky with dark bursts. The 332nd adjusted their positions in response to flak patterns, anticipating how bomber formations would drift during evasive maneuvers. Pilots scanned for gaps emerging between aircraft, closing them quickly before enemy fighters could exploit them. The operational tempo increased through the spring of 1944, with missions extending deeper into contested airspace. These long flights required careful fuel management. The Mustang's external drop tanks provided range, but the moment they were jettisoned, time became a critical factor. Pilots noted fuel consumption every 15 minutes, adjusting mixture settings based on altitude and throttle requirements. When combat occurred near the limits of their operational range, they balanced the need to engage enemy fighters with the imperative to return to base. These calculations were essential for maintaining escort reliability. A fighter forced to disengage due to low fuel created a vulnerability. Maintaining escort presence for the full duration of the mission required discipline in both engagement decisions and fuel management. As the bomber groups moved toward industrial centers and transportation hubs deeper within German-held territory, the Luftwaffe responded with concentrated resistance. Interceptions increased near Vienna, Klagenfurt, and the oil refineries that supported German armored operations. The 332nd adjusted their defensive tactics to maintain proximity during extended engagements. Pilots communicated essential information while minimizing radio transmissions that could reveal formation positions. The ground crews at Ramatelli maintained each aircraft with precision, reducing mechanical failures that could disrupt escort coverage. Every engine inspection, gun harmonization, and oxygen system check contributed to the consistency that bomber crews increasingly relied upon. By mid-1944, reports circulating through the 15th Air Force documented the consistency of the 332nd's escort performance. Bomber groups moving through dense flak and fighter resistance noted the predictable presence of the Red Tails during the most vulnerable phases of the mission. Pilots observed the escorts maintaining spacing during the bomb run, where the heavy bombers had to hold stable positions for accurate releases. This stability exposed the bombers to increased risk, but the escorts' proximity helped mitigate attacks timed for these critical windows. The interactions between bomber crews and escorts built trust that extended beyond formal mission reports. Informal discussions in briefing rooms, mess halls, and debriefing sessions spread accounts of the Red Tails' reliability across multiple bomber groups. The development of jet aircraft introduced a new phase of the air war. The Messerschmitt Me 262, with its high speed and rapid climb rate, represented a significant challenge. Piston-engine fighters could not match the jet's performance in straight-line flight, but they could exploit its limitations during turns, throttle transitions, and landing approaches. The 332nd encountered Me 262s during missions near Munich and Berlin, where German jet units attempted to disrupt bomber formations. The Red Tails responded by maintaining positions that forced the jets to adjust their attack angles, reducing their firing opportunities. During engagements near Berlin, pilots used the Mustang's maneuverability to counter jet passes, positioning themselves to intercept jets during vulnerable moments. These engagements resulted in several successful interceptions, demonstrating that disciplined positional tactics could offset performance disparities. The long-range escorts to Berlin, Ratisbon, and other deep targets continued into early 1945. During these missions, the bomber formations encountered diminishing numbers of enemy fighters as the Luftwaffe faced fuel shortages and declining pilot experience. Despite these changes, the escort doctrine of the 332nd remained consistent. The bomber groups continued to move through hostile airspace with defensive screens that emphasized presence, spacing, and coordination. The missions over Berlin in March 1945 demonstrated the effects of this approach. Escort fighters maintained close formation during the bomb run, intercepting attacks from multiple angles while maintaining fuel reserves for the return to Italy. The consistency of these operations contributed to the statistical records documented at war's end. When the European conflict ended in May 1945, the pilots of the 332nd had accumulated thousands of hours of combat time across hundreds of missions. Their operational records listed aerial victories, aircraft lost, sorties flown, and bombers escorted. These figures provided quantifiable data that analysts used to evaluate performance. Reports summarized the effectiveness of close escort tactics, documenting how the consistent presence of fighter coverage reduced bomber losses during the most vulnerable phases of each mission. The performance of the 332nd became part of broader studies assessing fighter escort strategies across theaters. Upon their return to the United States, the pilots and ground crews of the 332nd re-entered an environment far removed from the integrated operations of the European theater. Military bases in the U.S. remained segregated. The organizational structures within the Army Air Forces maintained racial divisions that reflected long-standing policies. The combat records of the 332nd contrasted sharply with the social restrictions imposed upon them. Reports circulated through military channels, noting the operational effectiveness demonstrated in Europe, but these reports did not immediately alter institutional structures. The post-war period included debriefings, evaluations, and reports from squadron and group commanders summarizing the tactical developments and operational lessons from the war. Analysts documented the effects of escort tactics across theaters, noting that close escort strategies reduced bomber losses in scenarios where enemy fighters concentrated attacks on vulnerable formations. The records of the 332nd became part of these analyses. These records provided examples of how consistent positional discipline influenced mission outcomes. Studies conducted after the war compared loss rates across multiple escort groups, identifying correlations between escort proximity and bomber survival. The broader military context evolved in the years following the war. In 1948, Executive Order 9981 initiated the desegregation of the armed forces. The operational records of units such as the 332nd contributed to discussions regarding the integration of personnel and the evaluation of performance across segregated and integrated units. Military planners referenced statistical records when assessing the capabilities of pilots trained in segregated programs. The documentation of escort missions provided quantifiable evidence that performance was determined by training, discipline, and execution rather than racial distinctions. In subsequent decades, The tactical principles refined during the war continued to influence escort doctrine. Studies of fighter coverage emphasized the importance of continuous presence during vulnerable phases of bombing missions. The experiences of escort units, including the 332nd, were incorporated into training materials used in military academies and advanced tactical programs. These materials discussed the relationship between escort spacing, reaction times, and defensive coverage. The statistical outcomes documented during the war formed part of the foundation for these analyses. Veterans of the 332nd participated in interviews, oral histories, and educational programs that contributed to public understanding of their wartime experiences. Their accounts described the preparation, discipline, and tactical decisions that characterized their operations. These accounts supplemented the formal records maintained in military archives. Over time, publications, documentaries, and academic studies examined the historical context of the unit's formation, its operational performance, and its role in broader social and military developments. These analyses often reference the documented escort statistics and tactical evaluations produced during and after the war. As the decades progressed, the experiences of the 332nd became part of the historical narrative of the Second World War. Archival materials, mission reports, pilot logs, and ground crew records were preserved in collections accessible to researchers and historians. The documentation provided detailed accounts of aircraft maintenance procedures, pilot training, mission planning, and tactical execution. These materials formed the basis for continued study of the operational factors that contributed to the unit's performance. The technological and tactical developments of later eras, including the introduction of jet aircraft, advanced radar systems, and modern avionics, altered the nature of escort missions. However, the principles underlying effective escort coverage, including positional discipline, coordination, and sustained presence, remained relevant. Training materials for modern fighter programs referenced historical case studies, including those drawn from the operations of the 332nd, to illustrate the effects of defensive geometry and escort strategies on protected assets. In the closing decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, recognition of the unit's contributions expanded through commemorative events, institutional acknowledgements, and historical publications. These recognitions documented the unit's operational performance and its role in shaping discussions regarding integration within the military. The factual records remained central to these discussions, providing quantifiable data regarding mission outcomes and tactical effectiveness. As surviving members of the unit participated in presentations, interviews, and educational programs, they contributed first-hand perspectives on training, operations, and post-war experiences. These accounts complemented official records, offering insights into daily operations, challenges faced during missions, and interactions within the military structure. The combination of formal documentation and first-hand recollections provided a comprehensive record of the unit's activities. The historical data regarding the unit's mission performance continued to be referenced in academic and military studies examining the evolution of escort tactics. These studies assessed correlations between escort presence, bomber survival rates, and enemy engagement patterns. The documented outcomes of the 332nd's missions formed part of these analyses, contributing to a broader understanding of escort effectiveness across multiple theaters during the war. The aircraft flown by the unit, including the P-40 Warhawk, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang, were preserved in museums, airshows, and historical collections. These aircraft served as physical representations of the operational environments in which the unit functioned. Technical records associated with these aircraft, including maintenance logs and performance evaluations, provided additional context for understanding the unit's operational capabilities. In academic settings, the experiences of the 332nd were discussed in courses examining military history, social history, and aviation developments. The documentation of their operations provided examples of how training, discipline, and leadership influenced mission outcomes. The statistical data recorded during the war served as reference material for analyses of combat effectiveness and tactical innovation. The neutral evaluation of their operational performance remained consistent across studies. Mission reports documented their adherence to escort doctrine, their consistent presence alongside bomber formations, and the effects of their positional discipline on bomber survival. These evaluations focused on quantifiable outcomes rather than narrative interpretations. The data provided a factual basis for assessing the unit's contributions to the air war. As research continued into the 21st century, additional archival materials became available, offering further insights into mission planning, aircraft maintenance, and tactical decision-making. These materials allowed for detailed reconstructions of specific missions, including factors such as navigation challenges, enemy resistance, and environmental conditions. The records of the 332nd remained part of these broader analyses, contributing to the understanding of escort operations during the war. The final years of surviving members of the unit saw increased documentation of their experiences through interviews, memoirs, and recorded presentations. These materials provided additional perspectives on training practices, operational procedures, and interactions within the segregated military system. The combination of these accounts with existing archival records contributed to a comprehensive factual record of the unit's activities. In contemporary military training and academic study, the operations of the 332nd are referenced as examples of disciplined escort coverage and effective positional tactics. The evaluation of their performance remains grounded in documented mission reports, loss statistics, and operational analyses. The neutral assessments of their effectiveness are based on quantifiable data rather than interpretive narratives. The conclusion of their wartime operations marked the end of their active role in escort missions, but the factual record of their performance continued to be examined in historical and military studies. Their documented mission outcomes, tactical decisions, and operational discipline remain part of the factual record of the Second World War and contribute to ongoing analyses of escort tactics and military organization. The operational records of the 332nd Fighter Group document 1,578 combat missions, numerous aerial victories, and statistically low bomber loss rates during their escort assignments. These results are recorded in mission reports, squadron logs, and post-war analyses that continue to serve as reference material in studies of escort tactics and military effectiveness. Their documented performance reflects the training, discipline, and operational consistency that characterized their activities throughout the war.